Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 216, and we're going to talk about first principles, or what I like to call the Dummies Guide to Assumptions. So I was listening to Dave Smith, and they were talking about first principles. And, I probably heard of first principles. I read Aristotle, but I never really, used that expression. And I was listening to his episode and they were talking about first principles, and I was thinking to myself, I kind of know what these guys are talking about, but let's take the terminology out of it and try to represent it in a way that I always use it and talk about it. But first, let's get back to the beginning. And so this idea of first principles comes from Aristotle. And the quote from one of his writings goes, in every systematic, oh, and I got this background information on various articles and entries about first principles, and it kind of goes like this. In every systematic inquiry, where there are first principles or causes or elements, knowledge and science result from acquiring knowledge of these. For we think we know something just in case we acquire knowledge of the primary causes, the primary first principles, all the way to the elements, which is a very confusing way of basically saying a first principle is a basic assumption that cannot be deduced any further, the first basis from which a thing is known. Basically, getting to the building blocks of an idea, of a theory, of a method, of an understanding, whatever. So, getting to brass tacks, or in physics, getting down to the elements. And so, this revival in this concept of first principles is basically because of Elon Musk, right? So, that. That fascist who's allowing everyone to have free speech, he when he talked about how he developed SpaceX, right, or the venture to try to get to Mars, he looked at the cost of rockets and he saw that the prices were just exorbitant, right? It was very, very expensive. But then he looked at how much the materials cost to build a rocket, all the different materials, and he realized that they were very, very cheap. And so he decided to start his own company to build a rocket, right? And so I guess what he realized was that the markup for building a rocket is just you know, out of control, right? Because the way NASA works is that they put a little bit of NASA in all the different 50 states of the union. That way, NASA becomes impossible to defund or kill. There are too many congressmen who will lose jobs, lose votes in their district because if NASA goes away. And so you basically have a broad support across the country in Congress for programs such as NASA. Everyone wants a piece of the pie, but everyone also wants to get paid a lot. And that's why the prices are just through the roof. So he decided to basically start his own company, buy the raw materials, and start putting together a rocket. And so he basically said the way I came up with this is first principles. It's the physics approach, right? And so I guess he has a physics background. Um, so, but listening to this and reading all of this stuff, it's not just for physics, it's all knowledge. All knowledge is based on something which came before. And, I wrote about it. It's called, I call it knowledge production, making knowledge from your subjective starting point. So what has now become accepted as true becomes assumed, and everyone moving forward assumes that bit of information as the starting point to move forward, and it's as if it's the only way or the only point from which you can move forward. Whether it is or not is besides the point. Right. And so you can see this phenomena a lot easier when it comes to revisionist history. All you have to do is change the starting point, right? So a lot of people today, when they talk about Ukraine, the starting point is the Russian invasion a couple of years ago. They ignore everything that happened before. And so people mockingly, you know, made fun of Putin, when he began, I don't know, a couple thousand years ago, when he says, to understand Ukraine, we got to start 1600 years ago. And people mocked him for it, right? But really, what he's saying is, my starting point is different than yours. If you go back further, you'll see that the justification for the things that I'm going to say, you got to know the backstory. And how far back do you have to go? 1600 years or so. And people made fun of him only because what it did was it showed that whatever it is that they were believing as true, aka the invasion of Russia a couple of years ago, is, rendered subjective, right? Now it becomes just not a fact, but something subjective, something less than fact. So as I was looking up first principles, I saw articles, business articles mentioning first principles, science articles, articles that talked about innovation, basically everywhere people are talking about first principles. And generally, the discussion is raised primarily because Musk talked about it and it, got everyone to start thinking about it all over again. And then people realized, oh, so this is a way to overcome barriers. It's a way to get to the next level. It's a way to innovate, or that is to introduce something different. But the whole time I'm reading all this stuff, I'm thinking, so it's basically something like deconstruction, which is what I always talk about, right? That phenomena that comes out of postmodernist discourse, which I have always explained as not the revealer of truth, but the revealer of subjectivity, right? Where did the information come from? What is the origin of that information? And so you're going to take apart whatever information that you have right now to see where it came from. Who made this information, right? What perspective were they using? What were they looking at? What were they trying to solve when they came up with this information? Because it matters, right? It influences what is ultimately produced. Uh, and so basically, I even saw someone in an article say, deconstruct, then reconstruct, which I'm sure is often said in postmodernist discussion. I say it all the time. Students, basically talk to me all of the time. They say, okay, so we're doing all this deconstruction. Then what are we supposed to do now? And I said, but that's reconstruction. But we can only do it subjectively, you know, do it in a manner that works best for us as an individual. And so your reconstruction, based on what you have learned through your deconstruction, is going to be unique to you. So moving forward from your deconstruction point, like where you stop doing your deconstruction, is going to be unique for you. And so in the way that I do it in the way that is most beneficial for me, which will not be what is most beneficial for you. And so you have to come up with a solution for yourself. And some students didn't like that. They thought it was a cop out when I would say that, but it fit into the broader understanding I have of society and human life and of the individual, that the smallest minority is the individual. I said that for a long time before I saw that Ayn Rand had said that first. And so credit to her, but I never read, her stuff. And so I found out much later. And the whole time I was thinking I came up with it myself. And no, I didn't, right? Other people have made that conclusion first. But anyway, so every person is the smallest minority. And so if you care about minorities, then you're going to pay attention to this. And everyone is unique. And so everyone's problems, everyone's challenges are going to be unique. And so what might have worked for me will probably not work for you. What made sense to me will probably not make sense to you, right? And so, broadly speaking, this first principles idea is challenging your assumptions, the assumed approach to things. What are you assuming to be true? And then all you have to do is, what is the basis of your assumption? Is it actually as true as you think it is, right? And so everyone will do this differently according to your values, according to how far you're willing to go, right? And so everyone is free to do it as much as they want or not to do it at all. And, we talked about that in class too, especially when I would get a really mature, astute student, right? They would say, how far are you going to deconstruct? How much do you deconstruct? And I said, it's all up to you, right? You deconstruct until you're no longer comfortable with it. For me, most of the time, my deconstruction is basically I use it to show subjectivity, that what someone is saying is not the truth, capital T, but it is just simply subjective, which means then you can't force everyone to agree with you. It is not the absolute truth, the end all be all, and if you don't believe this, the world is going to end kind of thing. It's never like that. And as soon as you reveal someone's subjectivity, then the discussion ends, right? You just have to believe what you want to believe, and I believe what I want to believe, and not to be confused with agree to disagree. It's just so it's so maddening. But I understand why a lot of people have to say it, because they are in conversation with a fanatic, someone who believes that what they have is the absolute truth. But it's just so annoying because there is no such thing as agree to disagree. Okay, I'm not agreeing with your point, right? And so I'm just merely saying you're subjective, I'm subjective, we're doing it differently. So leave me alone, right? And so it's I'm not agreeing to disagree. I'm s- trying to tell you that you're being subjective. All right, so getting back to the point, assumptions are the starting point of your vector, which is what I call subjectivity. Your subjective perspective is basically a vector. And in those of you who don't know math, basically there's a starting point, right? Starting point, and then you look out at the world from where you are, your location. And because your eyes are located in the front of your skull, you can only see in one direction at any given moment. So also in our knowledge, in our information, we generally look down a vector. And so if you hear someone's assumption, that is their starting point, the basis of their argument, the foundation of their subjectivity, and then they tell you something based on that assumption, then you know where they're looking, right? And you can make a reasonably accurate prediction about everything that they're ever going to say on that subject, right? Because you know their vector, you know everything that they're going to say has to make sense, has to be consistent with their assumption and the one point that they shared with you. Because if they deviate from that vector, then they contradict themselves. They're not really being scientific or mathematical. And so therefore their argument falls apart. And if they're that kind of person, excuse me. And so if consistency matters to that person, then you know everything that they're going to say, right? So nothing will ever surprise you because you know their assumption and you know their vector, right? You know where they're going to go. And ultimately, if we even push out even further, you'll know what they're trying to do, right? And so they might say, oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. Oh, yeah, you already know what they're going to say. In other words, you know what their objective is, you know what their conclusion is, okay? And the more you understand math, the more that becomes extremely obvious and it's sort of matter of fact, right? You know their subjectivity, you know what they're looking at. And so what they're looking at is their goal. Whether it's possible or not doesn't matter, but that's what they're looking at. I've said elsewhere that if you know their assumption and the point, then you know everything that they're going to say. I've said this before. And so their assumption becomes sacred. It is untouchable, right? And they will always fight to maintain it unless you attack it, right? And so basically, assumptions largely go unstated in a casual discussion. No one ever brings up the assumption. That's where I always go first. What are you assuming to be true? And once you start, touching that assumption, people get really sensitive, they get very defensive, but that's where you got to go. That is that person's first principle. Okay. So there's the Aristotelian understanding of first principle. Elon Musk talks about it. Okay, fine. But just get down to the average everyday person. Whatever their assumption is that person's first principle. It may not be scientific. You probably wouldn't be able to have some kind of Nobel Prize or anything about it. It doesn't matter because you're talking to that person, and that person has their own unique first principle. A lot of Christians, their first principle will be God, or might it be Jesus or something. But a Democrat, maybe their first principle will be power, the Democratic Party winning the election, whatever, right? So you figure out what that first principle is for that person, then it explains a lot of why they say what they say, right? And in fact, it almost becomes, it doesn't matter what they say, right? Because you know what their first principle is. You see what their objective is. They will do and say anything to achieve that objective, right? So there's the assumption. So there's a Machiavellian kind of tinge to it, but in Machiavelli, we're not looking at assumptions. We're looking at more of a groundwork, a framework of rules. And in that framework, you have a goal, right? So that's a little bit different in Machiavelli. Whereas first principles, you're actually looking at the assumption, and then whatever the rules are that you're going to construct, you're just going to construct as needed to achieve the goal that you have. So morality, it's subjective, right? Ethics, it's situational, right? And so you can play with morality even, like this whole discussion of war crimes, whether it's ethical or not, whether something is in fact a war crime, it becomes largely subjective because of who you support and what the ultimate goal is, right? And so obviously everything that impedes that goal is immoral, a war crime, whatever, right? They're the terrorists, not us, right? And so all of that becomes very plain to see, right? Once you understand this idea of assumptions and how sacred it is, it's so sacred that it's not even immoral. It's not even a war crime. You see what I mean? And so and knowing when you're up against someone who is fanatical about something, you just have to figure out what that assumption is, and that assumption is the basis of that fanaticism. So deconstruction, the way I use it, is working backwards from now, right? So you're saying, why do you say that? Why do you believe that? And so and I've talked about the question of why, using the question why to get at someone's assumption, right? So deconstruction is working backwards from what they're saying now, taking apart by just simply asking the questions why, right? So my deconstruction questions that I always would teach my class is define your terms, right? Define how people are using their terms. That gives you a lot of information of what their assumption is, right? And then you try to figure out where the information is coming from, like who paid for that information, who benefits and who loses from that information, right? And so it's this process that you're trying to dig down into someone's assumption, and that's how you find out what their subjectivity is. That's where you find out what their vector is, where their starting point is. And once you do that, it becomes very easy, not easy, very quick to know how you're going to undermine your opponent's argument. Just the other day, I was talking to someone, and they were really into supporting Israel, and so I just basically said, "Oh, you assume that." The government of Israel is representative of everyone who is in Israel, and therefore it is morally correct, right? And so I dispense with all of the emotional arguments and just go right to the assumption. You get to cut away a lot of the emotion, right? Because people really get intense. But once you get down and dig down to the assumption, a lot of that emotion, which is at the surface, is sort of in the rear view mirror. You get to very much focus on a logical takedown of their argument. I don't know. It takes a bit of practice to be able to do it well, but for me, it's almost like second nature. I do it all of the time. And so once you realize that their assumption is not viable, right, that's where you can then start proposing alternatives, right? So in religion, where I used to teach in the College of Liberal Arts in the religion department, I would always basically say, oh, what is the assumption here? Ah, it's the definition. So the problem comes from the definition of religion itself. What is religion? And then once you propose a definition of religion, which I came to system of belief, I've discussed this in other episodes, right? If you define religion as a system of belief, then everything is belief. It is not a fact any longer, right? And so people love to do that, right? Fact check. Really, what you're doing is you're codifying some subjective point of view and saying, yeah, it's a fact, right? But there are no facts in this world of deconstruction. There are only beliefs which we elevate to fact or truth. And with the introduction of more information, with different subjectivities, what a lot of people believe was the truth, in fact, just simply become subjective. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still a Jesus freak, right? And so I choose my fact. I choose my truth, and upon that, I build my subjectivity, right? And if it doesn't make sense, if it comes into conflict with what I say I believe and with others, then there's a re-examination that needs to take place. But it's because I know everything is subjective. Everyone's belief is subjective. I mean, you can't really get bent out of shape over it, right? If that's what you want to believe, that's what you're going to believe until it becomes too expensive to believe that. So assumptions reveal a lot. And it's often the assumptions that a person makes which are extremely problematic, right? And so when Dave Smith was talking about, I don't know, Sam Harris, I guess is the dude's name, right? The person was like, oh, I'm going to use first principles. But then he glossed over his own personal first principles, right? He was glossing over, he was assuming that his assumptions were first principles, and they were so not, right? And he was even using the expression incorrectly, which Dave Smith and Robbie Bernstein was pointing out very clearly. So I'll give you another example. Everyone is equal. Everyone's equal, right? And that's your assumption. That's your starting point. Well, you don't agree with it. You examine it, right? And so you say, oh, what do you mean by everyone? What do you mean by equal, right? And it quickly comes apart, right? Everyone is equal in what sense, right? And usually they'll, if you do the Q&A after a while, you'll realize that it boils down to rights. They're not equal in abilities. They're not equal in height or their preferences. They're equal in terms of their rights. And now you've reestablished a new starting point, and then you proceed from there, right? And so you can undermine someone's first principles. That is, you can undermine someone's assumptions by changing the definition. And I do that all the time. So race, right? I don't have a vague understanding of race. I clearly define it, a generalization or categorization based on a single identifiable characteristic. And that can be applied on multitude of things. And once you have a clear definition, you have shaped the perspective, and hopefully you have a better perspective. Or you can use the definition that other people are using and then turn it on its head, right? Like 3D printing. Printing. Oh, we're using printers. So 3D guns are free speech, right? It's speech. It's protected speech, right? And the guy who runs the company, ghostgunner.net or ghostgunner dot, yeah, I think it's ghostgunner.net, where they sell, what do you call it? Milling machines, right? So they graduated from the 3D printing to milling. And so they're selling essentially a block of aluminum. And with a milling machine, you can basically create, let's see, an upper, right? Or is it the lower? I forget. It's been a while. But anyway, the thing which is technically a gun, right? And so people are saying, "Oh no, what are you doing? You're selling firearms." And you're like, "No, I am printing. This is protected speech." It's a beautiful argument. It's I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, but that's how I remember it and understand it. Moneyball, that movie, if you haven't seen it, excellent movie. It's not because you like baseball, but because of the math, right? So baseball is a statistic-driven sport, and so they then use the statistics to figure out human performance. It's awesome. Postmodern jukebox, right? So they take these classic tunes and they put a twist on it, right? So it's the same song, people recognize it, but the arrangement is completely different, right? And so postmodern jukebox, what they're doing is they're digging down to the math, right? They're digging down to the music of the music, and then they change it, right? So, what people are basically calling first principles, we can say assumptions, right? And so the truth or the foundation of someone's subjectivity, it's their assumption, right? And so there's a lot of bad faith out there today, right? A lot of people assume Trump is evil. And so therefore, anything anyone else says, it's awesome. And as long as it's anti-Trump. Or to assume that Kamala Harris is qualified, well, then anything that she says, it's fine. Even if we have to edit everything that she says, it will reveal that she's qualified. We could do this all day, but here, I know I'm a little long. Here's the conclusion. But what you want to do is use it on yourself. Self-examination, right? Expose your weak arguments that you have yourself, right? You don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want to be out there running your mouth with a bad argument, with a bad theory, with a bad opinion, right? With a weak one. I should use weak, with a weak opinion, with a weak theory, right? You don't want weak, right? Having a weak argument on your sleeve, uh, thinking that it's a strong one. You don't want to do that, right? It's embarrassing. It's once you figure it out, you're ashamed, right? And it happened to me all the time. And so what I like to do is I try to use deconstruction. I try to examine my first principles all the time because I hate having a weak argument. I hate, it's like going to a competition thinking you're all, BA, you're the best, and then someone else is better than you, right? It's embarrassing, and it's humiliating as well. So what I like to do is, yeah, you see it in other people, but whatever. But what you want to do is you want to apply it to yourself. You want to examine your first principles. You want to examine your assumptions to make yourself better for the sake of future generations, right? Uh, but also just a matter of pride to keep growing, to progress in your life, to constantly improve yourself, right? Especially today in the face of people who just want to bring everything down. Sorry for going a little bit long, but I'm tired. It was a long day, and so hope you forgive me for that, and I will talk to you next time.